Let me welcome everyone to this spring 2022 Wallace Stegner Center Green Bag on the important topic of energy democracy. I'm Bob Kiter, the director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, part of the University of Utah. Let me begin by acknowledging that this land, named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between the tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the university's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities. Before turning to our program for today, a couple of announcements. We will convene again over the noon hour on February 24th for another virtual Wallace Stegner Center Green Bag. Our speaker on the topic of the Rule of Five, making climate change history at the Supreme Court, will be Professor Richard Lazarus from the Harvard Law School, also a visiting professor this semester here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. Richard has represented the United States as well as state and local governments and environmental groups in 40 cases before the United States Supreme Court, presenting oral argument in 14 of those. His most recent book is, in fact, the title of his talk, The Rule of Five, Making Climate History at the Supreme Court. And he will relate the inside story of the Supreme Court's 2007 decision in Massachusetts versus the Environmental Protection Agency, probably the court's most famous environmental law case. I'd also like to call your attention to the 27th Annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium, scheduled for March 17th and 18th. This year, we address another timely topic, the Colorado River Compact, Navigating the Future. It's the title of the symposium. The timing is appropriate. This is 2022 is the centennial year of the compact. The Stegner Center will be joined by the Water and Tribes Initiative as a co-sponsor of this year's symposium, which will reflect on the past century of water management and envision our common future in the Colorado River waters. That will include strategies to share water, to engage tribes, to integrate environmental considerations, and to adapt to climate change. Registration is open for the symposium with options to attend either virtually or in person. At this point in time, we are planning to proceed with an in-person attendance option, and most of our speakers are likewise planning to attend in person. We obviously will be guided by the trajectory of Omicron and the COVID pandemic, but things look promising at the moment. Our early registration ends March 4th, and we hope you'll join us and take advantage of the early registration discount. There's more information available, both about the symposium and about upcoming events. That's on the calendar of events on the Wallace Stegner Center's website, and we update that information regularly. So with that, let me introduce Professor Danielle Endres, who's a professor of communication at the University of Utah. She's also affiliated faculty in the Environmental Humanities program and the Global Change and Sustainability Center at the University of Utah. And let me also extend our thanks to my colleague, Professor Erica George, for calling our attention to Professor Endres' most recent book. Professor Endres' research focuses on the rhetoric of science and environmental controversies, including nuclear waste siting decisions, climate change, and energy transitions. She's currently working on a study on energy democracy in Puerto Rico. Her research generally focuses on principles of environmental justice and on how underrepresented groups and indigenous nations engage in science and environmental decision making. She is the co-author of Participatory Critical Rhetoric, Theoretical and Methodological Foundations of Studying Rhetoric in Situ, and also co-editor of several books, including the Routledge Handbook of Energy Democracy. She's published numerous articles, enjoys support from the National Science Foundation, as well as fellowships from the University of Utah that have funded her research. And we're very pleased about that because her research involves this critical question of energy and how we share equitably in energy, both in this country and beyond. So it's my pleasure to introduce now Professor Danielle Endres and the topic of energy democracy, a pathway to just, equitable, and democratic energy transitions. Thank you for joining us, Danielle.
I want to thank Bob again for that wonderful introduction, and of course the Wallace Stegner Center and the College of Law for hosting this talk. Particularly thanks to Jen Nystrom, Tricia Kirschman, and Spencer Cope, who've helped get everything set up for us. And then also, as Bob mentioned, I want to thank Erica George for connecting me with the Stegner Center to be able to present this work today. So we'll talk about a new co-edited book that I've produced with some colleagues on the topic of energy democracy, which we argue is a clear pathway to just, equitable, and democratic energy transitions. So we're in a period of intense energy transition that is linked with the looming and inevitable changes to our Earth, ecosystems, and societies from climate change. We can see evidence of this transition in a variety of local and international issues, such as protests over the Dakota Access Pipeline, local community calls for energy justice, controversies over community solar projects in the US and abroad, energy transition in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria knocked out the energy system, resistance to nuclear waste siting, and massive power failures. We saw some in Texas, and they're also happening abroad. So these examples all tell us that energy transition is becoming one of the most important challenges and maybe also opportunities that faces society. As much as there are powerful interests that are working to ensure continuation of status quo energy systems, there are also resistive narratives, other narratives, alternative narratives coming from voices that demand and make possible an energy transition that reconfigures our relationship with energy, that democratizes energy through widespread participation in energy decision-making, and that infuses principles of justice into our collective futures. These are the goals of the energy democracy movement. Energy democracy is simultaneously an ideal to which many communities strive, and it's also a process for making decisions about our energy futures. And it's a set of practices that seek to shift power away from fossil fuels toward renewables and away from privileged people who benefit the most to underrepresented communities, frontline communities, who are the most affected by the entire life cycle of energy extraction, production, and consumption. So energy democracy responds to the challenge of a warming planet. These images show results from the latest IPCC report on anthropogenic climate change, indicating the need for substantial emission reductions to meet the goal of preventing warming beyond 1.5 degrees. And they indicate the need to radically and quickly transition to more sources of renewable energy. As my co-authors and I write in the handbook, the Routledge Handbook on Energy Democracy, energy transition is undoubtedly one of human society's most acute global socio-technical problems. In the midst of the climate crisis and its ongoing disproportionate impacts on marginalized, underrepresented, and under-resourced communities, there is an urgent need to incorporate the tenets of democracy, including justice, equity, and participation, into the crucial decisions people make about energy over the next several years. So my work on energy democracy began about 6 or 7 years ago, as many projects kind of begin. I was conversing with colleagues at a conference. We talked about energy democracy as a movement that was interesting and making some innovative arguments in relationship to energy transition. And so then it immediately struck my colleagues and I that our kind of ongoing interests in energy communication, just transition, democratic participation, not only fit with the discourses of energy democracy coming from social movements, but also positioned us to develop a research program that could then analyze, theorize, and study the concept of energy democracy. We held a symposium, and you see a few images on the screen from that symposium in July of 2017, where we brought together a group of scholars and practitioners to build a research agenda in energy democracy. In other words, talk about all of the ways that research can help to think through energy democracy. Similar to how environmental justice can be described as both movement and academic area, we sought to catalyze the academic area of study for energy democracy through collaborations with interdisciplinary humanities and social science scholars who have expertise in energy studies, democratic theory, participatory democracy, energy justice, and social movements. So now we jump forward to 2022, January of 2022, with the publication of the Routledge Handbook on Energy Democracy. And you see a picture of the book on the screen. This is an international and transdisciplinary edited collection that uses a social science and humanities lens to define key concepts, present state-of-the-art research, and highlight key on-the-ground practices of energy democracy. The book addresses the issues of energy access, ownership, and participation at a time when there are expanding social, political, and environmental and economic demands on energy systems, one of the most important of which is the ongoing climate disaster. This book works from the basic premise that an energy transition rooted in democratic principles is our best hope of achieving just, equitable, and culturally appropriate solutions across the many scales of decision-making about energy, local, national, international, all of those. So today I want to start with a conceptual framework for energy democracy. This is a framework that my co-editors and I develop in the introductory chapter of the volume. And this sets the stage for how we understand energy democracy theoretically and conceptually. And then I'll give a brief overview of the book and the sections in the book. This is an edited book, so there are chapters by scholars across disciplines, across the US, internationally, in this co-edited volume. And then I picked out a few of the chapters that have some particularly interesting cases, concepts, and findings that I'll share. And then, of course, I'll open it for Q&A. So the conceptual framework for energy democracy. So we argue that energy democracy is a composition, and we draw from Bruno Latour, who argues that compositions acknowledge that things have to be put together while retaining their heterogeneity. Latour offers composition as superior to a mindset of critique because it turns attention to building alternatives that can have impact in the world, as opposed to the tendency of academic critique to stop at deconstruction or stop at critique and not provide alternatives. So composition works as a framing tool for energy democracy in two ways. First, it focuses our attention on how seemingly disparate things like energy and democracy, can be mashed together. And then it encourages what's called an engaged research program that can respond thoughtfully to immediate crises, as opposed to only critiquing. And composing, of course, is not easy, but it's, we argue, an essential framework for the energy and climate exigencies at hand, and for academic scholars to be able to play a part in producing research that contributes to responding to these exigencies. So I'll go through energy and then democracy, and then I'll talk about energy democracy. So energy is any power that may be used to operate the infrastructures of the human-built environment. Humans derive that power from resources such as fossil fuels, solar, wind, hydroelectric, nuclear, biofuels, and the list goes on, that are extracted and harnessed, prepared, and then distributed in cycles of energy production that include resources, production, and consumption. Energy is used by humans to, of course, fuel the technologies that support our and our companion species' lifestyles. Yet the forces of energy in our lives can be both highly visible and highly invisible. For example, we could share an image or a tweet about the Dakota Access Pipeline protests on one of our many screens. And in that moment, we might be actively thinking about energy in terms of oil being transported through a pipeline, but also overlooking energy in terms of the electricity that powers the phone or computer or whatever device we're using to share that tweet. Or to make it even more relevant to today, we're thinking about energy in the context of this presentation, but perhaps not about the devices and the internet connections that are, of course, enabling this interaction today. So energy is everywhere in our modern world and infused in our everyday activities. As we consider energy as an ever-present part of our lives, we need to consider our own practices in terms of who benefits and who doesn't, and what is our role in the coming energy transition or the ongoing energy transition. Energy studies scholars Sovacool and Dworkin call for everyone to recognize our involvement in energy injustices and act accordingly. So next we have democracy, which of course is notoriously maybe both easy and difficult to define. I think we all think we know what democracy means. We certainly hear appeals to democracy as a social good over and over. We hear about risks to our democracy, both here and abroad. And so the term has been theorized, debated, and developed over thousands of years in scholarly literatures that identify numerous forms, practices, and ideals of democracy. For our purposes, we adopt the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's definition of democracy as a method of group decision-making characterized by a kind of equality among participants at an essential stage of the collective decision-making. So this definition aligns with the theoretical literature on participatory democracy or democratic deliberation that prizes active participation by those affected by decisions, equity, and also justice. Moreover, this definition recognizes that democracy is a process, an imperfect process for sure, but a process and not simply a utopian goal. Democracy as process can be temporarily enacted in particular situations and can occur at a variety of scales of decision-making from local to global. Democracy as process also requires constant vigilance. So I do want to briefly acknowledge that, of course, I know there are critiques of democracy, democratic theory, or democracy as practiced in particular nations. And our definition is not aligned with a particular political system, like America as a democratic nation. As noted, it's really a process of decision-making that sometimes is and sometimes isn't followed, even in democratic nations. And so the energy democracy movement maintains that there's value in striving to enact democracy as process as often as we can when we're making decisions about energy. So now we get to our composition or our mashing together of energy and democracy. So energy, democracy is a composition that retains the differences between the concepts, but also allows for a productive relationship that has the potential to do things in the world. The term energy democracy comes directly from on-the-ground community groups who use the term to describe their efforts and their processes and their goals. It is a social movement that is growing in strength and scope. Yet, while energy democracy movements are increasingly asserting their role in energy decision-making, when my colleagues and I started looking for academic literature, academic scholarship on the topic, academia had not yet substantively engaged with theorizing and analyzing this concept. So like I said before, similar to environmental justice, which is both a movement and an academic area of study, we wanted to create a research program that worked alongside some of the things that were being promoted in the energy democracy movement. In our attempt to catalyze a research agenda for energy democracy, we define energy democracy as an emergent social movement that reimagines energy consumers as prosumers, producers and consumers, owners and analysts, who are involved in decisions at every stage of this sector, from extraction to production to consumption. Energy democracy, therefore, includes a broad range of actors, democratic values, sites of participation, forms of justice, and relations of power. Technology studies scholars Winner and Sklove argue for democratization of technological decision-making so that publics can be more involved in technological decision-making. And so the goal of energy democracy is not to find that one perfect technology that is always democratic. Rather, the goal is to infuse democratic principles into all sorts of decision-making about energy policy and figuring out what is the most democratic in a particular location and context. So as we started thinking about energy democracy as a concept and as a theoretical resource, one of my co-authors and I, Andrea Philpott-Parker, developed a conceptual framework that places energy democracy at the intersection of technology, justice, participation, and power. Many frameworks for looking at energy transition look at economics, politics, and technology as kind of the standard things that we would look at if we're thinking about energy. We don't deny that economics and politics are, of course, central to any sort of decision-making about energy systems and energy transition. But we wanted our framework to reflect what the movement was saying, which is that it be based in democratic principles that are being strived for. So that includes genuine participation of stakeholders, even those that are not always included, justice in the process, distribution, and recognition of stakeholders, technologies that can reduce greenhouse gases, and equitable relations of power. And so, of course, economics, politics, they play into this model as well in terms of how they're related to these four components or principles. So the justice, power, participation, and technology framework allows researchers to examine theoretical models, empirical examples of ongoing struggles over energy, and practical recommendations for communities engaged in promoting energy democracy. In other words, these four components are both necessary to achieving energy democracy, but are also analytic tools that can be used to study local, national, and global decisions about energy transitions. This framework doesn't define one ideal energy democracy, but rather, as Chilvers and Pallett argue, it can be used to study the multiple energy democracies that are possible, or these multiple ways of advancing the principles of energy democracy across varied locations. So I'll just briefly talk through those components of the model. So justice, of course, is a prerequisite for a democratic energy transition. This component of the model builds from environmental justice movements, including climate justice, energy justice, just transition. And this component turns our attentions to issues of inequity, marginalization, racism, settler colonialism, anthropocentrism, and other contributors to injustices such as access to affordable energy, disproportionate impacts from energy development on Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, and voices that are generally excluded from decision-making. Attending to justice as an ideal of energy democracy recognizes that the energy transition is already happening, but there's no guarantee of justice. Indeed, the status quo environmental and energy policies tell us that justice and the concerns of people of color communities who are on the front lines is often an afterthought, if it's considered at all. Attending to justice also tells us that no energy technology is inherently just. Rather, justice must be actively pursued alongside energy technology implementation. The second component is participation, which is essential for the processes and outcomes of energy decision-making. We draw from participation, democratic theory, deliberation, and dialogue scholarship to focus on how individual and collective actors engage in decision-making about energy. Participation can span formal processes of gathering stakeholder input, such as public hearings, you see an example of that on the screen, to protest events for people who are not given a seat at the table or feel they're not given a seat at the table. Participation can also include community ownership of energy technologies. This is rooftop solar or microgrid community solar systems as an example. The key with participation is that it is genuine, involves all affected stakeholders, and can actually have an impact on decision-making. One of the key critiques of a lot of decision-making processes is that the public is kind of brought in at the end when a decision is already made. And so there's not a genuine way to impact decision-making. Fostering broad participation in energy decision-making can bring local, community, and public expertise that is based on everyday engagement with social, cultural, political, and ecological systems. And a couple of the chapters in the book look at how, in particular, frontline community knowledges are essential to energy systems. So then we have power as our third component. Of course, not in the sense of energy or electricity, which we could also talk about as power, but in the sense of political and social power. And so power, like democracy, has been theorized, been talked about. It's all across academia and scholarly literatures. But at its core, power is the ability to act or not to act to elicit change. Following Chantal Mouffe, we know that power is often unequally distributed in decision-making spaces, leaving some actors to wield more power than others. And a key example that the energy democracy points to is the disproportionate power that fossil fuel companies are having in energy systems in the US. Another theorist, Michel Foucault, tells us that power is also multi-directional. So we can speak of both controlling forms of power that are coming from above and also resistive forms of power that are coming from grassroots movements, activism, and those sorts of things. So energy democracy recognizes that forms of social, political, and corporate power cannot be ignored when we talk about energy systems and energy transition, and that seeking justice and genuine participation, the other two components I've just talked about, requires a balance of power that is more equitable and democratic. Last but not least, technology. Of course, technology is key to our energy transition. We need to implement technologies that already exist, innovate technologies. Of course, they play a strong role. But technology alone cannot and will not solve the climate crisis. The energy transition to address climate change is fundamentally what science and technology scholars call a socio-technical issue, meaning that the technology is already embedded in social systems and that those social systems need to be considered for implementation or adoption of these technologies. So developing a technology does not guarantee that society will see value in it or that publics and policymakers will accept the scientific evidence behind it. An example of this is nuclear energy can never simply be seen as a neutral technology. It's always already embedded in historical, cultural, political contexts. So we resist viewing the social, the political, the cultural, historical, the ecological as simply context for technology implementation. Rather, we see these elements as an essential starting point for understanding energy transition. Including technology in our framework enables viewing technology from these lenses of justice, participation, and equitable power relations, therefore reorienting the range of considerations and voices in technology adoption and implementation. So as you likely noted as I was talking, there is overlap and relationality between justice, participation, power, and technology. Genuine participation, for example, is more likely to create just outcomes and more equitable relations of power. Energy democracy is at the center of the diagram because it relies on intersecting principles and practices of justice, robust participation by affected stakeholders, more equitable relations of power, and then this suite of technologies that can be chosen for particular locations and contexts. So as I noted before, while energy democracy is an ideal, there are many possible energy democracies in practice. So next, I will just let you know a little bit more about the book itself. Here's an image of it. I co-edited it with the scholars that are listed on the screen. And the book proceeds in 6 sections that we have here listed on the screen. So scalar dimensions of power and governance. So this is just looking at governing at different scales, local to international. Discourses of energy democracy. This looks at the ways that the communication that we use to talk about energy transitions can help us to understand the values and assumptions that are undergirding those word choices. Grassroots and critical modes of action. So this looks at strategies that have been used by local communities and energy democracy movements. Then we have democratic and participatory principles. So this is where authors in that section get into democratic theory, public participation, theorizing, and showing empirical evidence of what forms and strategies of promoting democracy and participation work the best, and those that don't work as well. Then part 5 is energy resource tensions, which is where authors in each of those chapters take a particular energy technology and talk through the tensions for democratic principles that might exist in those types of energies. And then the final section, Energy Democracies in Practice, is a set of case studies that highlight a range of successful practices and processes of energy democracy that provide insight into doing the practical work of building towards energy democracy. And so we have case studies that look at carbon neutral pledges, collaborations between the global North and global South, energy sovereignty on Indigenous nations. And so through these 6 sections, we get a broad kind of swath of many, many ways that scholars from different disciplines, both domestic and international, can help us to build our academic understanding of energy democracy towards then academics and scholarship playing potentially a role in energy transition. So as I said, I wanted to highlight a few of the key chapters in the book. So in this chapter, it focuses on critiquing energy dominance policy that was introduced by former President Trump. And it hones in on the importance of the executive branch in terms of climate and energy policy. We saw that under Trump, we saw that under Obama, we're seeing that with Biden. But they focus on Trump's energy dominance policy, and they critique it according to some of the principles of energy democracy. And they talk about how that choice of words, that political rhetoric, sought to make energy dominance and the continuation of fossil fuels seem reasonable and common sense. And the chapter shows that part of promoting energy democracy is also understanding the arguments that are out there that might be pushing against energy democracy. This chapter is great. It takes us to Thailand, the Pa Dang community that live in the Kang Krachan National Park in Thailand. And the author notes that while Thailand is a non-democratic state, there was a coup in 2014 that kind of initiated a non-democratic state. If you follow Thailand, you've seen that there are ongoing democratic protests. But at the local level, this community was able to practice energy democracy as they transformed their energy system away from kerosene cooking to biomass cooking, as they brought online a set of community solar panels that had never been used or implemented before. And the chapter looks at how the local practices of the Pa Dang community enact justice, participation, and equitable power relations, suggesting that democracy as process can manifest, persist, and thrive even within a non-democratic national regime. This is another great chapter. It relates to some of the new work that I'm doing on energy democracy in Puerto Rico. And this one focuses on the role of academics as being a part of energy transition. And so you may know that Hurricane Maria dramatically exposed to the rest of the world many of the flaws of an aging electricity grid that was primarily based in imported fossil fuels. Almost 3,000 people died, and some people were out of electricity for a year as a result of Maria. So even before the hurricane, local communities had been working toward community solar. They intensified their advocacy after Hurricane Maria. And then the Puerto Rican government and a failing utility company are seeking to revise, repair the grid. And so there's a very transitional moment in energy and electricity grid in Puerto Rico. And so Perez Lugo and her co-authors were founders of the National Institute for Energy and Island Sustainability. And this chapter highlights how this institute played a key role in bringing academic insight into policymaking. And the institute serves as a model for future academic and public partnerships that strive towards these tenets of energy democracy. This one, I'm promoting my own chapter, but I'm doing it because I really want to promote the work of the graduate student who's now a faculty member, actually, Taylor Johnson, who worked on this with me. And in this chapter, we focus on enactments of energy democracy in Indigenous nations on this continent. These offer successful models of energy democracy on a national governing level. We focus on how Honor the Earth, which is an Indigenous environmental organization, supports and works with Indigenous nations in enacting sovereignty and self-determination about energy, sometimes called energy sovereignty in their nations. And of course, there are over 500 Indigenous nations in what we now call the US alone. So this is not, these are not general to all Indigenous nations, but particular strategies that were undertaken by particular Indigenous nations. And so we look at three strategies that enacted principles of energy democracy. The first were solar installation projects on Indigenous lands. The second were Indigenous governments hosting public hearings when the federal government failed to provide them. And that was in relation to Dakota Access Pipeline. And then Indigenous nations using their self-determination to adopt resolutions to ban fracking. So those three examples show how energy democracy principles can be enacted by Indigenous nations. And then finally, last but not least, this chapter makes an important argument that renewable energy technologies are not inherently just, equitable, and democratic. Finley Brook focuses on a cross-national approach by showing similarities in large-scale hydroelectric energy projects across various countries in what we now call Latin America. And one of the projects she highlights is the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil, as you can see on the screen. She highlights the injustices, particularly for Indigenous peoples, in these dam projects, and argues that to promote energy democracy requires adherence to UN statutes, such as those on the rights of Indigenous people, reforming international banking systems, and ensuring government oversight. So these are just a few of the many wonderful chapters in this edited book. And I chose them to show the breadth of what's covered in the handbook. I wish that I could have talked about all the chapters because they're really wonderful. We've got about 30 chapters total in the book that delve into lots of other interesting cases and theorizations about energy democracy. So in closing, before we transition to the Q&A, I want to return to Bruno Latour's notion of the composition, or the putting of things together while retaining their heterogeneity. And not only is energy democracy a composition that puts together energy systems with democracy, as I talked about in the beginning, but we see the handbook as a productive composition. It's a composition of multiple disciplines in the humanities and sciences, all speaking to an urgent issue. It is a composition of scales, theories, concepts, empirical evidence, practices, and more. And it's also a composition that can give guidance to practitioners, publics, and policymakers in pursuing the most democratic possible energy transition. So in the spirit of inviting you as my wonderful audience members to think about how the energy democracy composition affects you, I invite you to reflect on these questions in relation to energy in your own community. So do you know where your energy comes from? Do you know who makes decisions about energy in your community at local, state, or national levels? What pathways and processes are available to allow you to participate in decision-making about energy? Who is invited to be a part of decision-making? Who's left out? Who benefits from energy decisions? Who doesn't benefit, I would add? And how can you contribute to making the energy transition more democratic? So I want to acknowledge that this is collaborative. Of course, I highlighted some of the chapter authors in my slides. My main collaborators on this project since that very beginning are Tarlare Peterson, Andrea Feldpa-Parker, Leah Sprain, Nico Hernandez, and Stephanie Gomez. And then this slide shows some of the institutions that have been involved, as well as some of the funders for this work. And with that, I would love to do some Q&A with all of you in the audience. Thank you so much for your time listening to my presentation.
Danielle, thank you for that very enlightening presentation and tying together energy and democracy and linking it also obviously to climate change and other concerns that are part and parcel of the future that we're contemplating currently about where we're headed with energy. Let me remind the audience that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen that you can use to transmit questions. I'll pass them on to Danielle, and we'll take it from there. During your talk, we had a query come in the chat room. It's probably visible to everyone. I'll see if I can summarize it. It ties into a local issue where there's equity, energy types of questions are wrapped up. It goes in Arizona, where we've had coal plants on or near reservations closing, but where many people have no electricity. Just Transition advocates have proposed both large-scale power plants to replace the coal plants that have or are closing, and to create some jobs and income. But also electrifying homes at another alternative suggested, electrifying homes at the expense of the closing utility with solar or battery storage to make those homes less dependent on large-scale plants and the grid. How does that one or the other of those alternatives fit in with the energy democracy movement that you've revealed to us?
Great. Yeah, thank you. That's such a wonderful question, and actually relates to some of the research that I've done with my graduate student on thinking about energy democracy, particularly for Indigenous nations. And so, without kind of doing the analysis and knowing all of the details of that particular case, I can't at this point say, yes, it's energy democracy, or no, it's energy democracy. What I would do to be able to evaluate that is look at those components that I presented in that framework. So to what extent do these shifts from coal to alternative sources of energy on the Navajo Reservation enhance justice? To what extent are they fostering genuine participation? To what extent are they seeking equitable power relations? And one of the things that's so important when we're thinking about Indigenous nations is, again, recognizing that those are sovereign of connection with the United States federal government, settler colonialism, and such. But that would be a really key component to also analyze if we were to look at this particular case, is to see how is this case, how is it working with the Indigenous, with the Navajo Nation, with the tribal government that is impacted, and is that tribal government fostering participation with its citizens, pursuing policies that are just and equitable. And so again, the idea of the framework is that it gives us these principles, and then we can take any case, right, of a local community, an Indigenous nation, a state government, a national government, and we can analyze it through those principles of energy democracy to help determine how it fits within those principles. Right. So thank you for that great question.
Great. Thank you for that enlightenment on that, excuse me, in the this Indigenous context. Another question has come in. The questioner says that they're concerned about how the hearings at public utility commissions are very complex, and how capacity meetings by grid operators are not even known to the public, that these determine whether utilities can take in distributed generation. And without that capacity for two-way movement and a complementary fair pricing system, we won't get prosumers very easily. I think this relates to some of the concerns about the rooftop solar and the like here locally and elsewhere, and the relationship between homeowners and the utilities.
Absolutely. Yeah. And any of you that are joining from Salt Lake City know that over the past several years, we've had a lot of controversy over rooftop solar and Rocky Mountain Power, which is our utility, and the way that the pricing structure is set up, and the modes of public participation that are involved. So, many government agencies and also public utilities tend to follow what's called a decide, announce, defend model of public participation. And I hinted at this a little bit in the presentation, but it tends to be a model that is based in kind of making a decision and then taking it to the public to sort of check off that we've done some public engagement. And so that's sort of a model which has been heavily critiqued throughout public participation literature, particularly environmental public participation literature, kind of allows for some of the problems that were noted in the question. So if it's a sort of a checkoff that happens after a decision is made, there's maybe not a huge incentive to advertise it really broadly and get a lot of people to show up to one of these public hearings. There's also a tendency, kind of given that many of these decisions are really, there's a lot of technical detail. There's a lot of kind of techno-scientific or like really intense economic kind of arguments that sort of frame these as discussions about technology and maybe economics, and don't generally invite the sort of expertises that can come from members of a community. And so, yeah, that is what energy democracy is really striving for. It's striving to kind of move away from these decide, announce, defend models that have really been shown to be problematic towards more dialogic models where people are invited very early on into decision making. The kind of points that they bring up can actually have the potential of maybe changing decision making. So it's a big challenge to implement this. There are some hopeful signs, particularly in terms of federal government Department of Energy seems to be really trying to shift to models that are more inclusive. Anyway, I hope that answered the question.
Related to that, it occurs to me, are there efforts afoot either by the utility commissions, the agencies, or industry to sort of help educate the public so they can participate meaningfully in some of these technical and or highly difficult economic equations that seem to be part and parcel of making energy decisions?
There are, it really depends on which region of the country, and I'm talking mostly US. This is also international. And so it just depends on the location, the country, as to how involved the industry or utilities are in seeking to kind of educate public so that they can have the resources to be able to engage in these conversations. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that education is kind of one piece of it. And then with that education, making it a dialogic encounter where publics can have meaningful say, can have meaningful contributions to decision making.
So related to that, I believe there's instances where by law, consumer advocates have been employed by or appointed by the government to get involved in these types of proceedings. Is that relatively common or still unusual at this point?
I don't actually know a lot about that. That's something that I could probably learn more from you about. And so I can't say if it's more or less common to bring that in. But certainly any sort of actions that encourage moving towards these more genuine participatory models are a benefit, I think, to democracy and to energy decision making.
Great, thank you. So we have a query tied into the International Petroleum Industry Environmental Conservation Association that has elevated support for just transition as one of their top areas of focus as part of the 2021 to 24 strategy. How could those of us in the oil and gas industry advise clients on how to best incorporate, communicate, and track how companies are participating in a just transition? So as someone on the inside looking for some guidance as to how to actually engage in the transitional process.
Great. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I'm thrilled to hear that there's someone that is part of that industry that's here on the call. I think that as a starting point, these principles that we've defined through energy democracy, we kind of see just transition as sort of a subset of this larger energy democracy movement. So returning to those principles of thinking about issues of inequitable power distribution and making those more equitable, thinking about justice, thinking about forms of participation in everything that's done can be great. I think in terms of actual corporations and how to sort of hold corporations accountable and help them in that transition, sometimes federal regulation is a way that can encourage certain benchmarks and actions. I think that professional organizations can be a great resource. I happen to know a lot about nuclear energy, and so the kind of professional organizations that work on nuclear energy can be really great at developing sets of principles and goals as they kind of pursue their argument is for including nuclear in the mix as we engage in this transition. And certainly the just transition really focuses our attention on ensuring that as we transition away from primary dependence on fossil fuels to more renewables, that we're very attentive to workers, that we're attentive to those in communities that would be impacted by this, and that we're attentive to things like jobs, and ensuring that as we transition to renewables, that we're also providing training, and that we're attentive to the justice implications for those communities.
Thank you. Just to follow up on the consumer advocate point that I made, one of our participants just notes that there is provision for consumer advocates here in Utah, but notes that they often are reluctant to endorse renewables as an alternative. At any rate, just to put that in some context. Another question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Danielle.
Oh, I was just saying, great. I'm happy to learn about that. I'm going to look into it more.
Another question. The questioner notes that your presentation seems to take the position that participation by disadvantaged communities in energy decision making will produce just decisions. And then notes that disadvantaged communities have their own political processes and issues in terms of whether they're democratic or not at the end of the day, and goes on to ask, is it your view that local participation necessarily will produce just decisions that will be more or will be viewed more as just to the broader societies in which they are typically embedded?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think the reason that energy democracy, both the movement and the academic area, is devoting a lot of attention to maybe underrepresented communities is because underrepresented communities tend to be the ones that are not getting as much of a voice in decision making. Now, I think that any particular issue, if it's a local issue, if it's a national issue, really, we want to encourage equitable power relations. We want to encourage that that we're just asking those questions of justice for whom, who's benefiting, who's not benefiting from those situations, and answering those questions can really lead to a variety of configurations of populations that are not being served in a particular situation and populations that are being served. And so, our kind of tenets of energy democracy are really focused on just allowing for communities that have not traditionally been involved in the decision making to have their voice. But it does not mean that that voice is the only voice that comes through the conversation and the decision making.
Another question notes that there are communities that are quite cost sensitive to energy costs, along with communities that have jobs dependent upon, if you will, traditional fossil fuel energy. And as a result, the powers that be, the decision makers, are responding to concerns by their constituents about expense, job loss, et cetera, are quite resistant to any sort of transition to renewables. Is there a way to move the thinking in those communities from short-term to long-term?
That's a tough challenge. I think that, again, as I was saying, one of the keys to our framework and to thinking through energy democracy is that we have to ask that question of who's benefiting and who's not benefiting during this transition. And so that means that we care a lot about those workers that might lose a job as, oil or gas or coal comes back on offline, and that really good decision making is going to take that into consideration and take into consideration transitioning into new jobs or new systems, new energy systems. And so those constituents are very important in a transition. In terms of how to kind of persuade those communities, I might reframe the question and say, how do we get a good dialogue going between all of the stakeholders that would be affected by a decision, and that frequent and early public participation that really gets all of those affected into a room together to dialogue and discuss and talk through, and then potentially then lobby, if we're talking on the state level, lobby representatives in terms of this kind of consensus and dialogue that's actually happening across different communities that might be affected by it. But that is a tough, the sort of, how do we get all of the parties at the table with genuine participation is a tough challenge that scholars have been working on for many, many years.
Yeah, you mentioned scholars. You have a question about how can we get us at the academic level or the ivory tower out into the community, engaged in some of these issues. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you are an academic and you have expertise in any aspect of the energy system, then I encourage you to talk to local politicians in your region. You don't have to advocate for a particular policy, but you can talk about your expertise and what that brings to decision making. Nonprofits are often looking for partnerships. They don't want academics to kind of swoop in and change the direction of their nonprofit, or just kind of extract knowledges and produce publications. But genuine partnerships between academics and local community organizations, nonprofits, can be a great way to get involved. I happen to be a scholar that works a lot on public participation processes. So I've worked with a variety of community groups to foster listening sessions, alternatives to public hearings. So even just if you work in that area, being a person that can help facilitate the types of democratic decision making or deliberation can be a great way to connect with the community.
Let me ask you a question that occurred to me during the course of the presentation, thinking about the democratic connection to energy transition. California's playing a major role these days with its renewable standards, not only in terms of influencing and directing how energy is produced and used in California, but it's having an impact elsewhere. In other states, in industries located elsewhere, and within the state for that matter. How does that fit into the notion of energy democracy? This is a big fish in a big pond, I think, maybe one way to think about it.
Yeah, yes. I wish we had a chapter on California in our handbook. We don't. But a couple of things. One is that, some of the mechanisms, some of the ways that have been approached by California can be analyzed from this kind of analytic, and then potentially can be used as models for other states. A second thing, and this is really my co-author, Andrea Parker, who talks about this. So all props to her, but she really talks about how as we get shifts in national and international regulations and laws and leaders, that energy democracy requires this kind of movement between different scales of governance. And a lot of that will depend on whether the regulations that are most in line with energy democracy are happening at the federal level or at the state level. And so it's kind of this this sort of contextual issue of thinking through, given the political legal structures, what are those nodes of politics? nodes of regulation that can particularly promote energy democracy at a particular time. And as we know with California, sometimes it's at odds with national policymaking, sometimes it's in line with national policymaking. So just kind of thinking through those shifts that occur in where the kind of most energy forward or democracy forward decision making can happen.
Great. Let's take one final question. The questioner notes that we have a system that's dominated by investors that support the various companies that are producing energy today. And energy production requires long-term investments, looking far ahead, and it's not easy to shift gears, and it's a real cash cow for energy producers. That is to have these investors online. And so I think the question really is, sort of how do we address that problem? It's an economic one. It's a very real one in a capitalist system like ours, where we have a private investment intimately connected to and in many respects driving our energy system.
Right. Yeah. And this, of course, also brings up the sort of divestment movements that have developed to encourage, not investing in particular companies and investing in other companies. It certainly plays a big role. But I served on the Senate, the University Senate committee that sort of investigated divestment and reinvestment at the University of Utah. And so really delved into some of that research. And I was actually surprised to see that there's already been a lot of movement of big investors towards renewables. There's even been some major big investment firms like BlackRock that are shifting towards renewables. So that's one piece of it, is that there's maybe already this shift going on. And then for some institutions, the investment portion is only one piece. There's also the piece of, kind of in the practices of the institution or the city or the state. There's all sorts of other tools that can be used, carbon neutrality pledges. The University of Utah has done a great job actually in transitioning away from fossil fuels and more reliance on renewable energy. So that investment piece is important, but it's only one piece in this kind of larger challenge of how to transition.
Well, I think that speaks to that complex diagram you introduced your talk with, in terms of the many pieces that are both moving and interlocking, and the challenge of moving each of them as we move forward. So with that, let me thank Professor Danielle Endres for her presentation today at the Wallace Stegner Center Green Bag on energy democracy. We very much appreciate you joining us, sharing your research and expertise in this area. Let me remind the audience that the Stegner Center's next Green Bag will be February 24th with Professor Richard Lazarus from the Harvard Law School, talking about his book, The Rule of Five, Making Climate Change History at the Supreme Court. And also, let me remind you about the 27th Annual Stegner Center Symposium on the Colorado River Compact, March 17th and 18th, with registration available online currently. With that, thank you again for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks. Have a good afternoon.